And our next speaker now is Mr. Dan Sullivan, who's going to talk about some of the alternative solutions. We're beginning an alternative solution schedule. And this is getting away a little bit from the current crisis that has come about after these schedules were decided and written. But Dan has been politically active for decades with the Georgists, and I've noticed over the last 5 years he's become more and more interested in monetary matters, and that he has a great capacity for study and learning and getting to the right conclusions. And part of this comes from Henry George, who did reach correct conclusions regarding money in his earlier works especially. Dan is going to speak on, and Dan will introduce himself further if he thinks it's necessary.
I'd like to thank Stephen for a number of things, but one was on the internet where he promoted this conference. He described me as the brilliant but combative director of saving communities. In your thing it says save our cities. I've never really been of the opinion that cities were particularly savable because the government's too big and corrupt to tackle till you've done it right somewhere small. But anyhow, as far as the brilliant but combative, I called him up and I said, Stephen, I want that changed. It should be brilliant and combative. There is no contradiction. You know, the Shaolin monks are the people who brought martial arts to the world. So I told him that, and it didn't be changed. But had Stephen been bluntly honest, he probably would have put in brilliant but cranky. Partly because I don't travel well, and so I come to these things tired, and when I'm tired, I tend to be cranky. I met Stephen at the Georgist conference. I had begun to learn about the monetary issue a few years before that, and someone had given me Robert DeFremery's book back there, who talks about land as a privilege and money as a privilege, and or money issuing as a privilege. And so when Stephen spoke, I think he recognized that I was one of the Georgists who got it and was passionate about it. And so he gave me a free copy of his $60 book. He doesn't want to know that anybody got a free copy. But he knew that I had no money and he knew that I had passion, so he gave me a free copy. And I set about to read it, and I want to tell anybody who is thinking about this book that if you sit down and try to read this book the way you would read any other book, your head will explode. If you read this book in less than 2 months, and you're not already steeped in monetary reform, you will have to read it again and again and again. This is the biggest piece of information overload I have ever seen this side of the telephone book. But every time I go to argue with my fellow libertarians about monetary policy, I find myself reaching for this book, because every time they say something historical, I go back and they say, well, the Continental crashed, the Continental currency was worthless because it was fiat currency, and I said, no, it was worthless because the British sent boatloads of counterfeit currency, and our currency was, Ben Franklin was sophisticated enough to prevent common counterfeiters from breaking it, but he was nowhere near sophisticated enough to prevent the British Mint from counterfeiting it. And actually today you can tell a counterfeit Continental from a real Continental because the real Continental has defects. So it's that kind of thing that's not in the book, but that it led me to that. Anyhow, I wanted to say that we do have differences, but this reform, basically I call it the Greenback reform, to harken back to Lincoln, is so fundamentally right that whatever differences we have can be reconciled, and if they aren't reconciled, I'm ready to push for it the way that I don't think is the right way. And I want to talk about the political mind and the economic mind, by which I mean the political mind is the guy who wants to sell something as it is and wants everybody to agree with him that he's right. And the economic mind is the guy who has designed something and wants people to tell him what's wrong with it in case there's something wrong. So in my economic mindset, we have differences. Stephen thinks the Federal Reserve should be nationalized. I think it should be abolished. Okay. My view on this is generally that if you have a dog that's been biting and maiming the people it's supposed to serve, putting the dog on a leash is not a solution. But I could be wrong because we haven't really gotten into the detail of what the Federal Reserve has to offer if we had it more under our control. So I could be wrong. But if I am wrong in my economic mindset, I want to know why I'm wrong. And if I'm right, in Stephen's economic mindset, he wants to know why I'm right. But in the political mindset, like if some of us go to talk to the local congressman, he does not want some guy saying, well, Stephen wants to nationalize it, but we really should abolish it. No, that's what you do in your economic mindset. In your political mindset, you either have an ally or you don't, and you either back him or you get out of the way. So that's kind of the problem that we have here in this conference, is that we're trying to do both. In other words, we want to improve our understanding, we want to reconcile our differences, we also want to develop solidarity and come together and make this work. And in doing that, there's a little bit of tension involved. But I think because we have so much agreement and because we recognize that the differences are not unimportant, but not deal breakers, that we can do that. And so we want to go through that. Now, one of the things, initially, Stephen had a very low opinion of local currencies. And I think he's come to recognize, as Alistair said, local currencies are not the solution, but they can provide relief. And they can demonstrate if a good local currency in a community, if that community does better than similar communities without a local currency, that can be a demonstration. And so to me, that's the value and the limit of local currency. I agree with Stephen that government per se is not the problem, but I think that big, complex, overly centralized government is the problem, and a structural problem. It's doing so much that it's too confusing for the people. To get this through, we will need allies. And my concern about the political solution without these local demonstrations is that our allies will sell us out. There are 3 lobbyists in Washington for every elected official. So for every person doing what the public business, there's 3 special interest representatives whose full-time job is to whisper in their ear and tell them how to do it. So they're under that constant barrage. But more importantly, if we have allies, for example, I think Stephen is absolutely right. If we had this, we could easily afford public health care. If we had this as individuals, we could easily afford private health care. But what will happen is if the healthcare reform people become our allies, the special interest people will come in and work with the congressman and work with them and say, you guys sell them out on this greenback crap, and we will back your healthcare plan. And they'll make that promise to everybody, and they'll break it to most of them. But they won't break it until after the movement has lost momentum. And that's the problem with the centralized approach. The problem with the decentralized approach is unless you can pay your income tax with your local currency, it ain't going to survive. So there's that problem that it's not local currency or monetary reform, it's local currency and monetary reform. Now I want to talk a little bit about the types of local currency because I love the idea of local currency, but I have problems with the ones that are proposed. First of all, to do very quickly, the idea of private currencies and competing currencies replacing the national currency, which is the libertarian view. I'm in a kind of a better position to argue this than Stephen because I am libertarian, I think like a libertarian, and I can be very precise. I can grant them everything that they're right about and say, wait a minute, you have a logical inconsistency here. Mises, when he says facts do not refute my theory, what he's really saying is, well, you can throw up some facts, but I'm sure there's some other facts that show that your facts are not that right. Just as Stephen, when he says, yeah, you got your facts about how the Continental was worth 3 cents on the dollar by the time it was run, that's a fact, but there are other facts that when you look at the other facts say that it's misleading. And the only difference with Mises is he doesn't feel obliged to go out and dig up those other facts. He just says, well, those facts must be misleading because they don't fit the theory, and the theory is internally consistent. So my approach is to say, the theory is not internally consistent, here's your inconsistency. One is, I totally believe in free trade. There is no such thing as free trade in privilege. Privilege is in itself a negation of freedom and a negation of free trade. I had a libertarian once who said, Lincoln needn't have abolished slavery. The free market would have taken care of slavery. And I'm going like, how can there be a free market in slavery? That is the most internally inconsistent nonsense I have ever heard. So when I talk to them about competing currencies, I say, I have no problem with competing currencies if the government does not accept them for the payment of taxes. If the government accepts some currencies and not other currencies for the payment of taxes, it's not open competition. It's government sanctifying private monopolies for the currencies it accepts and rejecting the currencies it does not accept, and it's not a free market. So they're stifled by that. And they say, well, what if the government just says it will exchange your currency for the government currency at whatever the rate is? And I said, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you just exchange your own currency for the government currency and pay the tax? And they get all confused, and so those kind of things work. But the competing currencies as a final solution doesn't work because your obligation to the government is not a market obligation, it's a social governmental obligation. And the only way libertarians can think that that's not important is that they think there shouldn't be any taxes and the government should have bake sales. And that's where they begin to break down. So, so that one I don't have much use for, even though the libertarian principles I think are just fine. It's just that they have a right-wing caricature of them when they try to apply them. The value of money, and talk about different semi-good systems, but I first wanted to talk a little bit about the value of money and the value of land. Both the value of money and the value of land arise from production and exchange. When people are producing and exchanging in an area, the value of that land is much higher than where nobody's producing and exchanging. And the highest value land in the United States before the 9/11 was the land right around the World Trade Center, because that's where production and exchange was the greatest, certainly where exchange was the greatest. And the value of money comes from production and exchange. Every economist will tell you that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Okay, then who created the value of the money? The people who created the goods created the value of the money. And the people who are creating the goods, for some reason, are borrowing money. My first inclination that there was something I didn't understand was when people were saying, why are we bailing out Chrysler? And I said, Chrysler's been producing wealth for 70 years. Why does Chrysler need to borrow anything? And that was just that in the back of my mind. In the front of my mind, I was saying, yeah, why are they bailing out Chrysler? But that's where those things start to sink in. How can the people who've been producing wealth be in debt to people who don't? So money and land, the value comes from social activity. Money is a commons. It is privately held, but it's issued for public purposes. Everyone has an equal right to new money, and if you have more money than someone else, that's because you earned it. Land is a commons. It is privately held, but serves a public or social purpose. Everyone has an equal right to land, and if you have more land than somebody else, it should be because you earned it. And under a land value tax, which is what the Georgists argue for, you don't get land speculation. You get people holding more land because they earned it and they're using it and producing more wealth with it. And people will have more money because they've earned it and they produce more wealth to get it. The other difference is land is fixed in supply and fluctuates in value. Money, if it's any good, is fixed in value and fluctuates in supply. But basically, the fundamental principles of the land question and the money question are the same. And in the progressive movement, those were the two things that were dominant. Now, with that connection between land value and money value, we come to the conclusion that rent or taxes is the natural redeeming feature of money. In other words, if you have dominion over land, either as a landlord or as a government, you have a way to redeem a currency in perpetuity. Even if you die, the next person who has dominion over that land, or even if your government collapses, the next government that has dominion over that land can redeem that currency, and maybe should be obligated to. Let's is the common thing. Let's is not based on that. Let's is based on personal obligation. Originally, Let's was a credit-debit system, so we're going to create this system. You may go up to $1,000 in debt, or you may go up to $1,000 out of debt. We're not going to let you go further because the system is not strong enough to handle that. And what happens is it becomes, if you die in debt, your obligations are gone. If you die with credit, I don't know, maybe your obligations can be transferred. But the problem is that personal obligations are not stable, which is the problem with credit money. People cannot live up to their personal obligations. Forget about charging interest. There is a social product, which is rent, which is what taxes come out of. And when government issues money, you can always use that money to pay your taxes. When landlords issue money, provided they continue to put the land out at the market value, they can always redeem the money. So when we look at what happens in depressions, we see something in between that. We see businesses that do put out products getting into trouble from time to time and printing bonds that don't bear any interest, but their workers accept these bonds. In my case, Tom Johnson was the one I wanted to talk about, and I had a book, if anybody knows where it is, I left it here last night, called Jaybird. It was about the Johnson steel rail process. And there's a picture of this in it somewhere, but I don't need it for this purpose, but, oh, it's under the, okay. If anybody wants to look at it afterwards, there's a Johnson $5 bill. In the panic of, I think it was 1893, the Johnstown Mill found that their buyers, he made streetcar rails, their buyers were so strapped that they couldn't buy any rails. So he gave them credit directly as a company. And in order for him to make his payroll and give them credit, he asked his employees to accept these $5 certificates as part of their pay. And legally, he couldn't do that, so the employees would show up at the window, they would be paid, and they would step over to the next window and buy as many of these certificates as they were willing to buy. And these certificates circulated in Johnstown for a number of years, but were eventually redeemed by the company. Basically bought them back when it was necessary. These didn't really get redeemed by purchase because ordinary citizens don't buy streetcar rails, but they did get redeemed once the mill got back on its feet. And it was probably successful because Johnson and his partner, who was in Johnstown, were the heroes of the Johnstown flood. They abandoned their personal concerns and organized to save people from typhoid and all sorts of things after the Johnstown flood. And so I think people accepted their money partly for sentimental reasons, but it did work. They did pay them back. Canada Tire did this. Canada Tire, if you're not from Canada, Canada Tire is not just a tire company. They're like Sears Roebuck. And Canada Tire, for a while, was issuing Canada Tire dollars. And they were redeemable in that you could buy things at Canada Tire with them. Now, the risk of this as a theoretical model is, what if Canada Tire had issued so many dollars that it was in their interest to raise all their prices so that when you went to redeem them, you were redeeming them at a fraction? If they knew they were going under, they would do that. It's a sensible thing to do as a price. So there is a risk with that too. But a stable company producing wealth can issue money in that way and redeem it in that way. But a consortium of landlords, like Cleveland is in distress, there are some functional landlords there, could get together and create a currency and say, we will accept these currencies as rent. And maybe to gild the lily, they could attract you into their apartment complexes, not by lowering their rents, but by saying, if you live here, you will have no local income tax to pay because we will use these rent coupons. We will rebate your local income tax. So you pay your income tax, you register it with us, the city tells us how much you paid at the end of the year, we give you these coupons, and you can spend them if other merchants will accept them. But ultimately, your merchants will accept them because their employees rent from us, and the rent will come back to us. And landlords can do this profitably because it makes people who have these dollars want to rent there. So that's kind of my notion of how the rental thing would work. I like the Let's plan. I think the Let's plan is designed by people like me, who have lots of passion and no assets. And so they have nothing with which to back the money except their passion. And passion doesn't seem to be good for credit much, as I've learned. So they're at a handicap, and it's not a faulty design because they're too stupid to do a better design. It's a faulty design because you have to have something. You have to have something with which the money can be redeemed no matter what you as an individual do. So I can give you work hours, but if I should be hit by a bus and my work is not worth anything, the money is not redeemable. But if I give you rent coupons and I get hit by a bus, I will still be able to collect the rent, and whoever comes behind me will be able to collect the rent. It's not so much an irony that a government entity should issue money, and that the logical private entity to issue money is a landlord. The word landlords were originally appointed in early feudal times, and under common law, a lord was a great person. Under common law, a lord was a great person recognized by the rest of the tribe as a great person. So when you had a question about something important, you went to a lord. If you had a question about war, you went to a warlord. If you had a question about land, you went to a landlord. And landlords evolved over time not to cease to be a government, but to be a government with no authority over them. So if you are in the city of Chicago, you are governed by the city of Chicago. But if you are in a shopping mall in the Chicago area, you are also governed by the shopping mall, and you follow their rules just like you follow the government's rules, because they can't arrest you, but they can evict you. And they can arrest you for trespass if you come back in again. So there is a sense in which a landlord is a government, and which collecting rent is a government function privately performed. So that's basically my message. I'll find this page, and if anybody has any questions, why don't you take the questions while I go look for this page. Thank you.